And we are live. I am Matthew Schutte, and I'm here with Gene Russell. We might have Larry Mellon, possibly other people joining us after that. And this is the first in a weekly summer series of conversations that I'm hoping to do on cultivating collaborative capacity. And so I'm basically hoping to tee up a different topic each week, but since this is kind of first week, there's probably going to be intro. Oh, Larry says he sees no link. 1 second, let me fix things. Links.
Technology is so
Is so what?
marvelous.
It is. Right. And it's getting better. Oops. Okay. It to your Gmail. Okay. Move this over here. So basically, I had teed up today's conversation. I mean, this is it's. I think it's okay if we wander and talk about whatever we feel like, but to give it some box, I had teed up a topic of what are some of the changes in biology, technology, and organizational structure that have given humans an improved ability to collaborate and coordinate. And I'm okay with us going wherever we want, including beyond humans, because I think there's a lot of really interesting lessons to be learned from looking at other sort of complex systems. But I know you have dove pretty heavily into all of this stuff for quite a long time. So yeah, I can kind of, is there anything that springs to mind?
But I have questions around the biology stuff. And by the way, I can hear myself, which means I'm able to talk.
Yes, let me put my headphones in.
So, I mean, you want to talk about biology in terms of like, we've developed language.
Hey,
that helps us collaborate.
Larry just joining us. Hey, Larry.
Good day, good day.
This is Larry Mellon. Larry, introduction to Gene Russell. You are two of my favorites. Sparkle fingers. And Larry, just to fill you in, I just read off the topic, which is basically, what are some of the changes in biology, technology, and organizational structure that have given humans an improved ability to collaborate and coordinate? And I'm cool with us going beyond humans and talking about other stuff, but that's kind of a little bit of a framing. And as sort of the larger picture framing, I'm hoping to do a series of these conversations throughout the summer, both online and in person. So basically looking to weekly online discussions with a limited number of people, and then live events here in San Francisco with a larger group of people, where we'll each week we'll explore one topic that is in some way related to cultivating collaborative capacity. So Jean was, I'd kind of teed up a question for Jean and asked where she wanted to take it, and she had a question about biology? Or?
Yeah, so, I mean, do you mean humans evolved the ability to walk upright and talk with voice and, you know, have sounds that make meaning, or?
I think all of it, yeah. Okay. Yeah, I mean, for me, this goes, like going beyond humans, this goes back to, this could go really meta really fast, but the ability for a cell to interact with any other cell is a form of communication, yep. Right? And so any change that improves that stuff. So one of the things that pops to mind for me is
that humans are better at recognizing faces than other objects. And my hunch is that when when somebody had the mutation that improved facial recognition and maybe improved a portion, the functioning of a portion of the brain that allowed them to be better at recognizing faces, faster at recognizing faces, etc. That group was able to coordinate at larger scales. They were able to regulate themselves better. They were able to live in larger groups, and as a result, they were essentially able to outcompete other groups. And so they gained a competitive advantage as a result of that.
Okay.
I could sort of see that. The brain is pretty wired for pattern recognition overall. The reason you can look at a bush and see only a bush until you finally see the outline of an ear, and all of a sudden a deer's head pops into view. That's a great hunting technique. What you're talking about, I think, is going beyond that into, well, now that I've got this pattern recognition engine, the ability to exchange information gives a competitive advantage, yes?
All of the above. So there's a communication with external parties, so there's a social side, but I'm interested in those, well, yeah, yeah. Since I'm really primarily focusing on collaboration, I'll leave the internal pattern recognition stuff to kind of like a separate thing. So yeah, I'll say yes. That as you got better at not only recognizing that was a deer, but being able to communicate to others that that was a deer. Those types of things. At the same time, one of the topics that we're hoping to do this, or planning to do this summer, is going to be on individuals as ecosystems. Right?
Individuals as ecosystems?
Yeah, so this is sort of playing with the idea that we have 10 million organisms living on our 1 million cell body. And so we are more other than we are us. And I think of that almost from the perspective of, if there's some little algae or bacteria or something living in our body that takes oxygen and converts it into CO2, right? It basically does a job, and it thrives in that environment because we give it lots of oxygen. And it does a job that's useful for us. And there's a whole bunch of, you can think of all these little organisms as little machines that are all working, they're all thriving alongside one another. And we perceive that as just us. But that microbiome, I think there's a lot of interesting stuff to explore there, and that's going to be one of the topics later on in the summer that we dive into.
Okay. So I would probably start instead with, because I buy into the basic concept, but look at your gut, for example. I mean, there are millions of completely independent organisms in there that we've evolved a symbiotic relationship with. That's pretty clear-cut. Whether or not you can say that a body evolved as a set of microorganisms is what I think you're trying to say.
Sure, something along those lines. I mean, I think if we don't have those, then we die, right? At some level,
we all agree that would be bad, right?
Well, no.
But I think it's even more than that too, because mitochondria supposedly might be some other species too that are not actually ours, and we're so dependent on mitochondria within every cell in our body. So what is the even line of identity there between what is me and what is not me?
I forgot about mitochondria. Very good point. You could also argue, Matt, that we have identified many communication paths between different specialized cell groups in the body. Like the neurons transmit little electrical zaps that communicates to some things. But there's a much deeper and harder to figure out connection pattern based on hormones, neurotransmitters being leaked out of various organs at various points in time. That seems a little more apropos, I think. Oh yes, so we're only starting to understand this now, I would say. I did some reading a few years ago into well, of course you both know the old adage that we only use 10% of our brains. That turns out to be because the guys who were measuring brains first only had ways to detect electricity. Exactly. And yet we end up with this fallacy that the body somehow evolved 90% dead weight up here and is just sitting there, what, is like a gel carrier for the neurons?
It sounds like you find that non-credible, Larry.
What's that?
It sounds like you find that non-credible.
Oh, I find it... well, which side do you think I'm leaning on here? Because I guess where I was trying to go with that, well, the first thing I was trying to go with that is never schedule a meeting after the Beta Breakers Day. That's just... that's my new
For those of you listening at home, Beta Breakers is basically a citywide party that is dressed up as if it were a run/walk.
Yes, and when a crazy hippie in Golden Gate Park passes you something, you should just pass it right along. That's rule number 2. So yeah, the evolutionary biology has made some interesting strides in terms of measuring, for example, the effect of having fire and tools on reducing the amount of gut we have to carry around. Vermiform appendix, the usual example there. So the notion, and they've made a pretty convincing case. So then the notion that the body would somehow evolve a 90% piece of dead weight, it just flies in the face. And yet, I've asked a whole lot of people, and everybody knows the story that we only use 10% of our brain. So I would say there's some sort of patterns floating around between groups of people, and if they seem plausible, our brains latch onto them.
Oh, that's the whole made to stick. Are you familiar with the book Made to Stick?
No.
It's a book about essentially how to make concepts sticky, or what sorts of things like burrow their way into your brain, and you not only buy into them but communicate them to others, and they go through sort of what the characteristics are there. So yeah.
There was another example that caught my eye recently. It was Komodo dragons. They're believed to have very virulent bacteria live in their saliva. So they're predatory hunters, but very lazy about it. They'll take one bite at a critter and then back away because, you know, getting hit by a hoof is probably bad for your future as a predator. So they basically take the long view, and they'll chomp down on anything wandering by, and then there's a constant supply of dead and rotting, half-dead critters laying around. So there's like a sort of a communal vibe going on there between the dragons. There's this sort of unspoken pact, if you will, to leave a large number of crippled animals around. So even if you're not hungry today, somebody
else can eat it.
Yeah. cripple an animal for your friend. It's kind of one researcher said, and he was really the first one to go, well, that doesn't sound quite right. I mean, if they have such badass bacteria in their saliva, how do they live themselves? Why doesn't that bacteria kill them? So he started digging into it, hoping to find some sort of great new antibacteriological nature warfare thing. And what he found instead was, yes, there's bacteria, but they're not the big weapon. They're a form of lizard that had evolved a poison gland instead of the usual snake kind of like fang one. It's the same gland, but it just sort of oozes out when they bite down.
Interesting.
Yeah. So another example of the fallacy that tends to stick.
So made the stick. So yeah, I'll and I want to hear more from Gene, but my quick comment is I have a basic assumption, and that's kind of guiding a lot of the work that I do, and that is if something exists in nature, it probably is useful, because nature tends not to tolerate waste a whole lot. And that doesn't mean that it's perfect. It doesn't mean that it's moral. It doesn't, but that it enabled some sort of survival or something along those lines. And again, that's an assumption, and I'm willing to question that. But as a general thing, if I see something, like for instance gossip, right? You look at gossip within communities and you go, that's there that does something. That's helpful for that group in some way. So that's kind of just my general assumption for life in general. And it makes it so that when you look at the world, you look at everything, and it all becomes a useful teacher. I was on a hike the other day, and I saw dandelions that were blooming, and I noticed that before they were blooming, they had all these little spikes around them, and they were very protected. And then as they were blooming, that was opening up, and then once they were bloomed, there was no protection at all. And it kind of, basically the principle I was trying to take away from it was everything needs safety at some level. It needs security at some level that allows it to mature, right? Like prior to those being seeds, they didn't want them to be eaten. Once they're seeds, once there's something there, great. Yes, we want to invite others to come and take this and pollinate and all that, but prior to that, we need some protection. So there's sort of a period where security might be important, so you can get to the place where you actually gain benefit from somebody else coming along and eating you. Or
well, Darwin is slow, but has had a few million years to work it all out. So you can kind of assume that there is something involved. Now, the danger with that assumption, though, is ecological valleys, mountains.
Sure.
So
well, and I want to be clear, like that, you end up having a solution in a context, right? You have
yes.
a solution that works in a context, and so the way I've been thinking about this lately is a constellation of resources. If there's alkaline just sitting on the ground and there's no organism that has anything to do with alkaline, it just sits there. But then if there's a mutation that leads one organism to be able to use alkaline as food, all of a sudden it's like, oh my God, there's food everywhere, literally everywhere, and it just it multiplies and multiplies and multiplies, and it's just eating and eating and eating and growing and growing, and all of a sudden that organism could be food for something else. And for a long time, there may be nothing that takes advantage of it, but what I realized was it's not just alkaline that would have to be there, it's a constellation of resources. That could be alkaline and water and sun, and so it's only with that constellation of resources that suddenly this becomes an environment where that organism can thrive. Right? You have to have all those things. And one of the benefits that animals have over plants is that we don't have to have that whole constellation co-located, because we can move, right? We can get one thing from here and another thing from over there. And so we end up being able to gather, essentially.
So,
Gene,
where were you going with the mimetic research line there? Because I think there's a strong correlation to the ecological concept of ideas permeating, but are often hit by valleys and mountains of their own?
The meme stuff, that was, I feel like that's a completely separate topic. Like Gene had shared the made to stick. Not that it doesn't have relationships, but I only brought that up because I didn't think that was like I felt like that was a separate topic, right? Like the made to stick stuff. Yes, there's utility there. Well, I'll backtrack a little bit. So, us as individuals, as organisms, at some level, we are all one, right? This is actually going to be another topic for later in the summer, but we are all one, and at the same time, we are each unique. Like we have boundaries, sort of. Like no individual can survive without interacting with the environment around it. It needs resources to come in. It needs some things to go out, otherwise it eventually explodes. The long story short is, yes, we are all one, but if we failed to be able to perceive distinctions, if I felt like, oh yes, I'm just all one, and I perceive no distinction between me and the environment around me, it would make it really hard to navigate. And so there's a huge advantage from a heuristic that may be technically inaccurate of perceiving myself as separate from the world around me, right? And so I think you see this a lot, where there is an evolutionary there's functionality that comes from believing a myth at some level, because it simplifies the world and allows you to take actions. Gene?
Oh yeah, interesting to watch. So I dropped the meme stuff in there partly because I feel like it brings the like made to stick thing together with some of this. Is it me and my body? Is it me and my head? That kind of like, is it me and the organisms that are in me, or is it I'm actually the organisms? Where who's who here? And there's been this idea of like, are the memes writing me, or am I writing the memes? Are they a virus in our culture, or are we them? Like, there's and to me that gets towards the core of the problem of communication, collaboration, cooperation. Like, identity matters. How do we, put an identity there? What distinctions we make matters to that. Who is who, then who gets to collaborate with who. Whether that's like on a cellular level or at an organizational level. The identity and then the flow between identities is the root of what we're talking about. And I'm interested in that play of like, who's the one in charge and who's the one being written upon or programmed, kind of thing. And feeling like it's interesting when you turn something like that on its head and realize maybe it's the other way around from what you always thought it was.
There's a William S. Burroughs quote, "Language is a virus." So to me, trying to talk about collaboration and language, you have to look at memes. I mean, that's primarily what we're trying to communicate.
Yeah. Oh, I wanted to add one other thing, which is my sense of the universe is that it operates from I can-ness. And so it's trying tons of experiments of whatever it can, and when it can't, it usually tries to press up until that threshold and overcome it, kind of like water to a dam, like just overcomes until it increases its complexity for production to allow it to overcome that hurdle. And so some of those things are useful and they stick around, but it depends when you take the snapshot. Like sometimes it just can, and then later it can't. But it's trying all these experiments just because it can. Like, it's not because it thinks and is intentionally trying, but just because that's the nature of like existing as atoms. Like, it's just operating from this I can-ness. And so what can we do? What does being, this hodgepodge of different organisms inside a human body mean we can do? And I'm curious what the answer to that is. And So that's my, like, your dandelion, what's going on there thing. Mine is this I canness. It's all functioning from a I can.
Yeah, and I like that. I agree that it's not an intent, not an intentional thing, but it's a. I was thinking the other day about why do we not see many organisms that seem to live forever, and I think part of that has to do with that there is insufficient randomness, right? There's insufficient changeability there to adapt to new situations. So you have something that's really well suited for an environment, and then the environment changes, and if it's not reproducing and having changes, then when that shift comes, that dies. And so the nature has favored randomness being introduced fairly regularly, because that creates resilience. Basically, diversity creates resilience, and that's kind of like I guess maybe 3 parts that I've been playing with there. One is diversity creates resilience. The second one is that nature tries to narrow diversity at some level, right? Circumstances shift, and it's like it lops off the guys with the big beaks. Suddenly they're not equipped to eat, and so it's like, nope, no more big beaks. And so there's always some pressure because you're going through one context, and then you're going through another context, and then you're going through another context, and things that are too far out of spec die off. And then the third part is, but if you can collaborate, right? If you can have the big-beaked birds that can crack open nuts sharing food with the long-beaked birds that can get into holes and get at bugs, and they're both sharing with one another, when there's no nuts, these guys still have worms to eat or bugs to eat. And when there's no worms, these guys still have nuts that these other birds have cracked open. And that collaboration enables greater diversity to survive through those various narrowings.
So I don't quite see it that way. To me, nature is rewarding the most adaptable genetic algorithm. So, using your example, the big beaked birds need to die off for whatever reason. Is it really, what's really dying off? Is that entire line of bird dying off? No, it's almost always the shape of the beak changes to match the type of nuts available. Which actually is how Darwin stumbled on all of this, was going through the Galapagos.
Galapagos?
Yeah, that one. And he was touring the islands and taking notes, and he saw that the birds were incredibly similar, except where they had evolved different types of beaks for the different types of seeds on the island. And the islands are exactly what you were talking about, with that limited context in which something survives. But the algorithm of nut-eating birds survived across all of those.
Sure. At the same time, I'm seeing this same concept applied not just to birds with big beaks and birds with small beaks, but also to things that eat alkaline, things that eat oxygen, things that, creatures, organisms that solve very different problems, but that when they are able to work together, are able to create an environment that works for all of them, and that is more stable, basically, and enables their mutual survival. So, I mean, a good way to think about it is like bees and flowers, right? Like, I don't think those come from the same genetic pool.
You're
but
right.
Their ability to collaborate enables them both to survive.
Yeah, I think you're right. I was sort of assuming that the communication was a key aspect to it, which is why I asked more about the memes, because that's essentially what's being communicated. So is it the genetic or the mimetic part is really, well, that's the question of mimetic engineering is, which is controlled? Is it the genetics controlling the ideas or the ideas controlling the genetics? You're talking more about symbiosis that evolved out of just, okay, I tried 100 million combinations, and here's one that happened to work in this particular circumstances, so that one propagates.
Yeah.
So you're basically trying to pull that down to the cellular level of the body, or the mind?
Yeah,
Thread of where you're trying to go.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, so you mentioned communication, and so the thing that I just wrote something down so that I could, because I wanted to let Gene speak actually, but I didn't want to forget that point. But I'll dive into it anyway. Communication at the cellular level. So I think communication at the cellular level. Well, I'll back up a little bit. I've been playing around with a biological, I don't know, concept. And drawing an analogy between that and social groups and trying to find principles that I could draw from one and apply to the other, right? So,
example.
So basically, there's a cell has a membrane that separates the inside of the cell from the outside world, and it lets things cross that membrane. And in the cellular world, that usually is determined by shape, right? You have the right shape, okay, you can come in, something along those lines. And it needs to let things in, and it needs to let things out in order to survive. In a social group, I've been thinking about what defines the boundary of a social organism, a social organization. And usually we think about that as like, oh, it's the legal structure of the company, it's this, it's that. But I don't think it's really those things. I think at the end of the day, the boundary of a social organism, the membrane, is defined in the minds of each of the individuals within that organization. And that individual either perceives you as outsider or perceives you as insider, as somebody that it's willing to interact with. And I think that perception ends up being shaped by experience. When you bestow benefit repeatedly, they go, well, this guy's great to play with. And you build, we usually use the word trust here, but you build some level of trust, you have an understanding about how to interact with them, etc. And you basically let them in. When you experience pain, even if that's not like financial pain, even if it's somebody making some backhanded remark and you experience a little emotional pain, instead of placing the defensive barriers on the other side of them, between them and the rest of the world, and them being inside, you start to raise up a little defensive barrier between you and them, right? And so I've been playing around with that. At one level, I've been trying to map out.
It's like you develop a lysosome to kind of section off that individual.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's just you.
That's nice.
When you think about this in the social context, you go, "Ooh, I know not to, maybe I don't talk to Jimmy anymore, or maybe I don't share the intimate stuff with him." And I'm trying to think through the different forms of relationships. And it's so using the cellular kind of analogy, it's like, okay, if you've got this cell and there's another cell over here, and you're willing to let that whole thing come inside of you, you're willing to host it, basically. I feel like that's kind of an intimate relationship, right? You're willing to be intimate with it. If you're not willing to host the whole thing, but it excretes things, that you're willing to accept, that's sort of like a transactional relationship. Like you have an intimate relationship with each of those little things, but with it, you're sort of transacting. It's kind of at a distance still. And then if you're not willing to take anything that it gives you, that's almost like war. It's a defensive version of war. Just you deny them. You've got a barrier to them. And that whole thought process led me to realize, oh, wait a minute. I've been thinking about this from this like God view, of looking at the system from above, but that doesn't, at some level, that doesn't really exist. It's always an action taken from a perspective. So from the perspective of this cell, it's like, am I willing to let this stuff in? And from the perspective of this other cell, it's, is this an environment that I want to be in? So there's a hosted relationship going on there, but it's always from the perspective of each of them. So there's this kind of negotiation going on at all times. Anyway, so that's been, over the last couple of months, that's where a lot of my thought has been at, and I've been trying to apply that to social groups and organizations and et cetera.
I totally agree from a social entity perspective. I don't think I agree from a cellular autonoma perspective. I mean, basically, we just finished agreeing. I thought that there's 100 million combinations being played out, and it's just the relentless, the cold equations that determine it. There's no intelligent communication going on. It's just I tried 100 million, and 99.999% of them failed. And hey, just by chance, it turns out you crap what I eat.
So I totally agree, and I guess the point I'll make is that willingness to interact or refusal to interact, which may be determined by shape, and the random processes, you know, that have happened through millions of years of evolution, is a form of communication, right? Like communication at its root means to commune, to come together, right? And so I'm taking communication and I'm sort of divorcing it from just meaning and brain intelligence stuff, and I'm starting to sweep into the concept of communication, literally the receiving or giving or transfer of resources. That could be oxygen, that could be alkaline, etc. But that is some form, and that may not be. I mean, I may be sort of screwing things up by using the word communication that way. But I'm trying to let go of my traditional understanding of what communication was, and sort of try to see what's, you know, physically going on there.
I wouldn't say you have a traditionalist view of communication.
Well, communication has words, right?
Gene.
Yeah, can I throw something kind of out of left field into the mix, given that you just said this is the experiment that I'm kind of running as a thought experiment on what communication might be?
Yeah.
I'm thinking a lot the last couple of years about time. And of physics being able to say, well, we can take time out of many of our equations and it doesn't really change things, and yet we have this experience of time, and that time is like changed based on, you know, the invention of clocks in order to coordinate railroads and stuff across time zones, and going, what is this thing that's time? And to me it plays so intensely into communication, because it's about communicating in the right span of time. It's like, it's one thing for me to send something out into the universe and who knows when ever somebody's going to get it, versus we're on a real-time chat right now and you're able to respond immediately to the thing. So there's something crucial to me about the information being exchanged on the same time flow. This is not the time flow of a redwood tree or a redwood forest. This is the time flow of humans. It's not the time flow of a fly. Like, there are intersections of those things where we're all coexisting in the world, but we understand information in the time flow pacing that we are in, and in order for that communication to be effectively received and responded to, we have to be in time flow with each other. So I'll let you play with that for a second.
Well, I think you're bang on. The analogy that it's been popping in my head while you were talking about that, compared to what Matt was talking about, is how ants communicate. There's no specific moment where Ant A tells Ant B, yo, come over here. they leave a series of chemical traces that, probabilistically wise, the ant will. Oh, the case was. Yeah, they were talking about how ants moved their egg cases in times of danger. And basically, an ant will pick up the nearest egg and wander around fairly aimlessly and drop it fairly aimlessly. But wherever there's a successful place to drop, like the eggs don't get eaten or lost, then the chemical trails there persist, and more ants will start wandering by there, and now it starts to look like the whole colony has a mind. And it does if you look at it from an ant time perspective. There is no individual ant, there's only the collective hive mind. But
each individual is seeing a stronger signal because there's been success repeatedly in that route. So we're seeing the built-up signals of multiple ants that haven't fainted or faded yet, you know, because they're just, yeah.
But the timeline notion is key. If the entire system only works because there's this slow persistence of time in the hive mind that also surpasses individual ants, that's probably the closest I can see to where you're talking about of communication and collaboration at the cellular autonomous level.
Yeah, you know, there's actually something, and I want to dive into Gene's question, but I'll try to address that first. I think it's important to recognize that evolution is not about individuals.
Yeah.
Evolution is about genes. And
it's not
me. Yeah, go. Go,
it's
Gene.
About me.
It's about me.
Me, Gene. My name is Gene.
No. Stop it.
Okay, I was a little slow.
They're spelled differently. And so it's not a competition amongst individuals. If it were, I think a lot of times that's why people have a hard time believing in evolution, because they see it as this theory, they misunderstand it as a theory that's about a competition amongst, you know, it's me versus you, and there's all these, again, coming back to collaboration, there's all these ways in which collaboration and working together and altruism is beneficial for the continuance of the survival and propagation of that genetic material, basically. Zero sum or non-zero sum, Gene says. Elaborate, Gene. Elaborate.
Well, I mean, zero sum is the sense of, like, does it zero out, right? Like, it's either me or you. One of us gets the apple. We can't both have the apple. And non-zero sum is your survival helps my survival. And so there are certain equations that totally end up being zero sum. Of, like, there's a finite amount of resources available.
Let's go kill the village next door and take their water.
But there's also lots of games that are not, and it's not one or the other. So there is competition for finite resources, but, you know, there's water, for example, in most environments, you know, in many situations is not actually a finite resource. Like, you're in a lake, it's usually full.
But time, it may be...
Time is a factor.
Sure, there'll be water again eventually.
But you have to look at the layers of those games in the environment. So which games are they playing that are competitive and zero-sum, and which games are being played that are non-zero-sum, and we tend to either or that instead of going both. Both things are existing at the same time. Both games are being played.
Yeah. Touching on Gene's point about time, I wanted to make a separate kind of related point, I guess, or start an exploration, and that was vulnerability. that time at some level has to do with a sequence, right? A sequence of interactions, and when there's sort of a like, I'll bring this to the social group level. When I interact with somebody for the first time, I don't, well, sometimes I do, I'm a little unusual, but I don't pour out my heart and tell them all my most intimate secrets, right? Like, hi, I'm Matt, and I was, you know, usually it starts with hi, or maybe even just a glance, like, you know, little chin, hey, how's it going? And there's a dance that happens there, and that dance it happens in a sequence, and when they react in a way that I like, you know, I'm willing to make myself more vulnerable, and so there's this building of trust. And I do think that whole that time matters there, that you don't get to skip from we are perfect strangers to I love you without going through some of those dances. And I think that's the case at a lot of, you know, at the social, like, organism level, but also in some of these other more cellular type levels.
While you two were talking, I couldn't get the classic game Prisoner's Dilemma out of my head. Where's the motivation for actual trust? I've never seen a solution that actually works.
I have an answer there. So they've done experiments with the Prisoner's Dilemma where they change the rules and they see what happens, right? And when a Prisoner's Dilemma is a single event, it's a one-time game, and in the next game you have no knowledge of what happened in the past, no ability to punish people, cooperation breaks down very quickly, right? So if there's no, like, history, cooperation breaks down very quickly. If you change the rules a bit and you make it so that you can punish the bad actor from the previous game, you tend to get cooperation in group sizes as large as, like, 16 people, I think it was, or no, maybe even 80, something like that. Really? But there's actually another piece that takes it even further, and that is if you change the rules so that you can not only punish bad actors, but you can punish people who failed to punish bad actors from the game before. If you get that, then you get cooperation and collaboration at group sizes as large as they've examined. And they call that altruistic punishment. And so this to me is like a really key thing. It basically means if you can punish if you need to altruistic, you know, you get hurt a little bit for holding somebody else to account. If you don't do that, if you don't accept getting hurt to hold somebody else to account, then other people are going to hurt you next time. If you don't have that flow, trust breaks down. If you do have that, trust can work. My belief is our reputation systems that work really well at small scale work because we have altruistic punishment functioning well, because the information flow is good enough. And so with the collaborative internet stuff that I've been working on for the last 8 years or whatever, I'm trying to build tools, I'm trying to design the architectures that enable us to do that same altruistic punishment thing at much larger scales, at global scale, in fact. And I'm trying to design those structures so that you can do that in a way that does not require agreement about what counts as good behavior, because I don't think we're ever going to agree about that, and it doesn't require agreement about who to trust. So amidst disagreement about who to trust, what's good, and even what something is, right? Amidst those disagreements, can we have that same sort of altruistic punishment process function? And I believe we can, and that's what I'm trying to build.
Interesting. That resonates. Did I talk to you before about the Gamergate and the auto blocker tools?
Go into it. Whether you've talked, we've talked a little bit, but Gene hasn't heard it, and nor has anybody who'll be watching this video.
Gene, are you familiar with the Gamergate scandals that were flopping around the internet incessantly?
Sure.
Give me the brief history, the like 10-second history.
There's a lot of misogynist pigs in the game industry, some borderline psychotic, I would have to say, with poor social relationship skills and way too much time on their hands. Some guy penned a hate-love letter to his ex-girlfriend, and yeah, there you go. Basically, she got piled on, just completely piled on, and people started taking sides, and people who took sides got piled on, and then Randy Harper threw together this really simple tool called Autoblock, GG Autoblock, that was it, for Twitter. And what it does is, if you are known to be, because you can look up Twitter with who follows who. So she identified, like, well, here's the 20 most toxic people in Gamergate. And if you are following 2 or 3 of those people, then you're automatically blocked from anyone using the blocker tool. You can get unblocked just by sending her an email saying, please, I'm not a jerk, take me off the list, and she will. And there's no there's no reason for anybody to do it except social pressure. And in fact, there's not even really social pressure. It was a really weird phenomena where people became apologetic and quickly tried to disassociate themselves from the bad actors once they were essentially ostracized from the Twitter pool.
Follower count matters.
So, but you were going to go somewhere with that. So I asked you to give the history. You were going to you were going to use Gamergate and talk about something else.
Well, sorry, that's what I tried to tie together at the end there. It was basically, it's a way of communicating trust and respect in a community, and
good standing.
Good standing. And it was really interesting watching even bad actors being pulled into it at the thought of being ostracized at this sort of public shaming level. That seemed really appropriate to what you were talking about.
Yeah, the altruistic punishment.
Yes.
Yeah, part of that altruistic punishment stuff, that's a form. So the way I see it, humans have 2 tools at their disposal for coercing one another to behave the way we want them to behave. One is violence. I'm going to whack you with a stick, you know, and the other is what I was historically calling reputation or ostracism or all these things, but I'm now referring to as access control, and that's because it includes not just banishment from the community as a whole, but also things like you're not invited to the party, or I do want to take you hunting, or whatever. So access control has both a positive side, hey, let me give you access to this resource. That resource could be me. And a negative side, hey, I don't want you to have access to this resource. And I think access control has, it's incredibly useful, and I've given talks about this before, so I'll try to be super brief. It's efficient. Like reputation and informal social norms, all that sort of stuff, it's efficient because we're sort of built to do this. It's effective. People really don't like to get cut off, per your Gamergate story. It's adaptable. We can change our expectations about what's appropriate sort of on the fly. It's tolerant of disagreement. And for me, this was the one that really made me excited. I had been searching for 10 years for regulatory structures that could enable society at a global scale to sort of function better. And the big problem that I always came across was, well, we don't agree. we're not going to agree about even the most basic stuff about how to structure voting and who gets to vote and all that kind of stuff. And it's tolerant of disagreement. And I've only recently gotten good at explaining why that is. I used to describe it as, oh, violence is binary. Either you get hit or you don't get hit. And access control is not binary, because you can get cut off from one person without getting cut off from all the others. But I've recently realized the reason behind that, the reason that violence is binary, and that we basically aren't able to disagree about whether that person gets killed. Like, we can disagree about whether they get killed, but once there's an action actually taken, they do get killed. There's no more disagreement anymore, right? Either they got killed or they didn't get killed. Either they get put in jail or they don't get put in jail. So it ends up forcing us to come to some sort of consensus about what the action that's going to, what action is going to happen. And the reason that is because the violence locates on the target. Violence actually is taken upon the body of that individual. Access control locates on the resource. The action is taken on the resource itself. Either this person says, hey, I want to date you, and this person says, I do not want to hire you, right? And so the location at which access is denied or granted is on those resources themselves, and as a result, we can disagree. Yeah. So I'll kind of leave it at that. Larry says violence is not binary. Leg breaking? What does that mean?
All the mafia's clearly laid out a nice little pattern for graduated stages of violence. Slap you around first time, recap the second time. So
the mafia, as my dad used to say when I was a kid, the mafia is just another form of government.
It is.
It really is, You had written down, Jane.
Yeah, I'm not sure about this binary thing either, but I do like the distinction between action on the body or access to the resource. That feels powerful to me.
Yeah. I mean, the basic gist of it is, if your way of enforcing norms is by throwing someone in jail or killing them, like, that's the threat that we usually use within a state. So states have a monopoly of violence. They're the only ones who are allowed to be violent. When that's your enforcement mechanism, it forces you to come to a single rule, right? Because the action that gets taken is taken on their body. And because it forces us to come to a single rule, and we live in a world where we're never going to agree about what that rule should be, that puts us in a bit of a conundrum for trying to regulate ourselves at global scale. Like, the problem that I had faced for 10 years, I was trying to figure out, can you change the United Nations in some way? Is there a way to hack capitalism or democracy, to enable us to regulate ourselves through peaceful means as opposed to being forced to go to war at some kind of regular interval? And at the end of the day, I kept getting hung up on, no matter what you put in place, because there's one rule that you end up having to come up with for a particular thing, whoever takes control of that violent power is likely to become a tyrant in some fashion. They're likely to use that power to oppress a minority group. And,
would you not think, though, that the United Nations expanded beyond that when they started to go sanctions, which is essentially shaming at the tribal level?
Yeah, I think sanctions is a form of access control. Right? I think that is states trying to do the access control game, for sure.
Yeah, you're probably right. I'm just keep popping up the Russian actions. The invasion into the Crimean Peninsula was just, hey, I don't really care if you guys tell me I'm being a jerk. Putin just went in and took it. So that particular rule didn't work out,
Well,
But
sometimes people are willing to wear that cost, right? Like, there's a lot of times in the world where we go, I don't care what you think, you know.
yeah, but I guess my point is that they slowly ratcheted it up. So again, it was more of a spectrum than binary. There was the pressure from the civilized world, and when that didn't roll, then there was trade sanctions on stuff that wasn't terribly important. And it wasn't until there was fighting in the Ukraine before Europe was willing to go to, all right, we're not going to buy your oil this winter.
And the next step after that is violence, right? To be honest, and I really want to be clear on something, and that is, we have both of those tools, right? We have both violence and Jean, go ahead.
Well, I want to break down the spectrum versus the binary thing because I think it's becoming clear to me. So, Larry, you're looking at multiple items and saying they're across a spectrum. And I think Matt is saying any one of those individual acts, whether they, the mafia smacking you up a little bit versus breaking your leg, each of those acts is either done or not done. And yes, collectively, like, they could go through a series of progressions, but each act either happens or does not happen to a body, to a person's physical body.
That's right. And let me be clear, the sanctions stuff, Europe could decide, yes, we want to impose sanctions, so we are unwilling to buy your oil. But if China is still willing to buy up all their oil, right? So it's not a binary thing. It's not like you bombed their refinery. It's that you said, hey, I don't want to buy from you anymore. Well, this is how markets work, right? If you aren't able to get enough coordination, then you can't force them. So to be totally honest, at one level, access control is a less coercive method because it requires a fairly broad consensus before it really becomes some kind of force. At the same time, the thing that I really like about access control is that it enables an individual, whether that's a country or an individual person, to exercise control over their own behavior, right? It enables you to take action right now. So I can decide, this is part of wanting to build the collaborative internet architecture stuff, I can decide that when I go to buy products, I'm going to look up whether those products use slave labor, either in the manufacture of that particular product or anywhere up to 4 steps up the supply chain. Right? I'm subscribing to people who are looking at those vendors and their vendors and their vendors. And if any of them use slave labor, I want a big red flashing light that says, warning, slaves. And I think if you have that capacity, if you make it really easy for people to do that kind of lookup, when people decide, I don't care, those people are actively supporting slavery. Right? Today, we may technically be supporting slavery, but we don't have any realistic way to avoid that. And so we don't have the capacity to choose a different path. As a result, we don't have the responsibility to choose a different path. I think by giving people that capacity, we actually then give them responsibility, literally the ability to respond, but also the ability for others who may find out about their use of that service to hold them accountable, to hold them responsible as well. And so I think that at the end of the day, you end up really improving the agency of individuals, but you also end up improving the agency of others to hold those individuals to account. So to kind of break this out one last step, a lot of our regulation that we do today is done by a third party. We outsource our regulation to a government organization to go do environmental checks or worker health and safety checks, or all that. And they're both coming up with the rules and then enforcing those rules. This vision, it's not that we would do away with that. You can still have that stuff, but this supplements that. It adds a separate thing alongside that where you as an individual can decide, well, I care about this, and I'm going to hold the people that I'm interacting with accountable to that. And it's really about you steering your own life and being able to put pressure on others, but it's about you being able to take action. Whereas right now we really aren't able to take action as individuals. The regulatory tools that we use only enable us to take action when coordinating as a large group, and that forces consensus. We are at about an hour. I want to just read a couple of things in the group chat because unfortunately Google loses its group chats when you log off, and nobody else at home can see these.
I copy and paste them into other documents.
Okay. Select all.
And most of the things that I posted in there are notes that just copy the things that we were saying. It was like, oh, that was an important item, like that capacity and responsibility, the ability to respond, like that could be a whole other conversation.
Totally.
That I think relates to the stuff that we're trying to talk about in this series. So,
yeah.
And then I made a note that I've been really interested in the Bloomington School of Social Philosophy, which included Eleanor Ostrom and her husband. And so I made a note that I should send you that paper.
I would love to see that. Yeah.
Yeah, actually send that to me too, please.
Okay.
And then Larry, you had shared something. Michael Lewis, Flash Boys. People had to individually decide to use the Fair Trade Exchange and then lean on their brokers to use it.
Yeah, this was part of the whole collapse restructure thing that happened. The high volume traders were getting like 100 microsecond advantage over other people's computers as to trade activity, and then they would zoom in and buy up stuff and essentially corner the market when they knew a big buy was coming down. So two things had to happen. Somebody had to say, I'm willing to get off this train and create a fair exchange where all the information is exchanged at a certain rate.
Interval?
Interval. In fact, they just coiled up a fiber line until it basically equaled 200 microseconds.
That's hilarious.
Then they basically started communicating to the investors how these traders were taking unfair advantage of co-location and data centers. And then the brokers, though, even when individual investors said, route only my stuff through the fair exchange first, the brokers were still going through other exchanges. And it took sort of a sea change of a few big firms finally going, I'm going to make the responsible choice and start pushing business here, versus the other guys who are ignoring their clients, telling them to use the fair trade exchange. So I think that has a bit of what you're talking about there in terms of a shared value system being determined by the community. It was pretty flexible, but there was... I'm struggling for words here. I think you know what I mean, though.
Yeah. No, I think it's a decent example of that pattern. Well, any last thoughts before we wrap up?
TikTok, Billy Ray.
Sounds great. This was awesome.
Thank you.
Really looking forward to this. We will. I'll definitely invite you guys back for more of these. Yay!
All right.
Bye, all. Thank you so much.
Bye now.